All right, guys. How you doing? Welcome back to Black Bear News, where everything is connected. And the viewers are smarter than the average bear. And we're doing a little book reading tonight. Thanks for hanging out. Gene says, I'll be sewing while I listen. Sounds great. Definitely not drag queen story time, Salt Lickers. All right, cool. Well, yeah, we've already done one of these readings of the Ministry for the Future. I was going to do this without my, because the light is pretty good in here, but I think I do want to turn this light on. So if you guys can just give me 1 second. That's how you know we're keeping it professional. Anyways, yeah, so we've already done one of these readings, and we read the first 4 chapters of the Ministry for the Future. I don't know how many of you all read this book, or if everybody's read this book. I feel like a lot of people have read this book. It's a good one. I really like this book a lot. He covers so many things in such a great way. And so, yeah, the Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson. We're going to start with chapter 5. And I'll just get into it. Maybe at the end of the reading, we're going to go about an hour. And at the end of it, maybe we'll do a little Q&A. I don't know. Yeah, maybe we'll discuss. Anyways, guys, I asked if you can to donate $1 or more or whatever you can via one of the direct donate links. If you can, if you can't, it's all good. It's free anyways. But Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, coffees, something. If you all could do it, I appreciate it. Okay. Chapter 5. We drove in with a fuel truck, water truck, all that. It was like going out into nothing. With the electricity out, pumps weren't working. Nothing was working. We set to work on the power plants before we did anything about all the dead. In any case, there was nothing we could do about them. The bodies were sleeping where they fell. This wasn't just the people, but all the cattle, too. Seeing all the bodies, cows, people, dogs. Someone said something about the way Tibetans bury their dead, called sky burial. Let the vultures eat the bodies. And there were some vultures doing that, yes, clouds of vultures and crows. They must have flown in afterward. Sometimes the stink was horrible, but then we would move on or the wind would shift and it went away. It seemed like it was too hot for smells. The air was cooked. The main smell was of burning. And things were burning, yes. Once the power came back on, there were some downed lines east of Lucknow, and brush fires started from them. Next day, a wind came, and the fire spread and got into the towns, and we had to fight the fire before anything else. We got particulate readings of 1,500 ppm. There was a lake we could pump from, next to one town near Lucknow. The lake was filled with dead bodies. It was awful. But we threw the pump intake out into the lake anyway because we needed the water. We were downwind of a brush fire. It was coming at us fast. So when the pump started filling out our water trucks, we were relieved. Then I heard a noise. At first I thought it was something in the pump line, a kind of squeak it was, but then it seemed to be coming from the lake shore, where there was a sidewalk running around the edge of the water. So I went over to look. I don't know. I guess it sounded alive. He was lying against a building across the sidewalk from the lake. He had a shirt draped over his head. I saw him move and shouted to the others and went to him. He was a Farangi with brown hair and skin that was all peeling off. He looked like he had been burned or boiled. I don't know. He looked dead, but he was moving. His eyes were almost swollen shut, but I could see he was looking at me. Once we started helping him, he never said a thing, never made another sound. His lips were cracked, bloody. I thought maybe his voice was gone, that he was too cooked to talk. We gave him water by the spoonful. We were afraid to give him too much at once. Once we got the word to team command, the medicos were with us pretty quickly. They took over and gave him infusions. He watched them do it. He looked around at us and back at the lake, but he never said a thing. His eyes were just slits and so red. He looked completely mad, like a different kind of being entirely. That was chapter 5. Give me a second. That tea too hot. Chapter 6, following the Great Indian Heat Wave. The emergency meeting of the Paris Agreement signatories was fraught indeed. The Indian delegation arrived in force, and their leader, Chandra Mukherjee, was exhilarating in her denunciation of the international community and its almost complete failure to adhere to the terms of the agreement that every nation on earth had signed. Reductions in emissions ignored, payment into investment funds that were to be spent on decarbonization not paid. In every way, the agreement had been ignored and abrogated. A performance without substance, a joke, a lie. And now India had paid the price. More people had died in this heat wave than in the entirety of the First World War, and all in a single week and in a single region of the world. The stain of such a crime would never go away. It would remain forever. No one had the heart to point out that India had also failed to meet its emission reduction targets. And of course, if total emissions over historical time were totted up, India would come in far behind all the developed nations of the Western world, as everyone knew. In dealing with the poverty that still plagued so much of the Indian populace, the Indian government had to create electricity as fast as they could, and also, since they existed in a world run by the market, as cheaply as they could. Otherwise, outside investors would not invest, because the rate of return would not be high enough. So they had burned coal, yes, like everyone else had until just a few years before. Now India was being told not to burn coal when everyone else had finished burning enough of it to build up the capital to afford to shift to cleaner sources of power. India had been told to get better without any financial help to do so whatsoever, told to tighten the belt and embrace austerity and be the working class for the bourgeoisie of the developed world, and suffer in silence until better times came. But the better times could never come. The plan was shot. The deck had been stacked. The game was over. And now 20 million people were dead. The people in the big room in the center of Zurich's Congress Hall sat there in silence. This was not the same silence as the earlier memorial moment, a ritual period of silence to honor the memory of the dead, which had stretched on for minute after minute. Now it was silence of shame, confusion, dismay, guilt. The Indian delegation was done talking. They had nothing more they cared to say. Time for a response, an answer to them, but there was no answer. Nothing could be said. It was what it was, history, the nightmare from which they could not wake. Finally, the year's president of the Paris Agreement Organization, a woman from Zimbabwe, stood up and went to the podium. Briefly, she embraced Chandra, nodded to the other Indians on stage, and went to the microphone. Obviously, we have to do better, she said. The Paris Agreement was created to avoid tragedies like this one. We are all in a single global village now. We share the same air and water, and so this disaster has happened to all of us. Since we can't undo it, we have to turn it to the good somehow. Or two things will happen. The crimes in it will go unatoned, and more such disasters will happen. So we have to act. At long last, we have to take the climate situation seriously. As the reality that overrides everything else, we have to act on what we know. Everyone nodded. They could not applaud now, not now, but they could nod. They could raise their hands, some of them with their fists clenched, and commit themselves to action. But that was all very well. It was a moment, maybe even a moment to remember, but very soon they were back to the usual horse trading of national interests and commitments. The disaster had happened in India, in a part of India where few foreigners ever went, a place said to be very hot, very crowded, very poor. Probably more such events in the future would mostly happen in those nations located between the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer and the latitudes just to the north and south of these lines. Between 30 north and 30 south, meaning the poorest parts of the world. North and south of these latitudes, fatal heat waves might occur from time to time, but not so frequently and not so fatally. So this was, in some senses, a regional problem. And every place had its regional problems. So when the funerals and the gestures of deep sympathy were done with, many people around the world and their governments went back to business as usual. And all around the world, the CO2 emissions continued. For a while, therefore, it looked like the great heat wave would be like mass shootings in the United States, mourned by all, deplored by all, and then immediately forgotten or superseded by the next one. Until they came in a daily drumbeat and became the new normal. It looked quite possible that the same thing would happen with this event, the worst week in human history. How long would that stay true about being the worst week? And what could anyone do about it? Easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Great line. That excellent sentence there. Kudos. I'll read that again. Easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The old saying had grown teeth and was taking on a literal, vicious accuracy. But not in India. Elections were held and nationalist, nativist BJP party was thrown out of office as insufficient to the task and partly responsible for the disaster, having sold the country to outside interests and burned coal and trashed the landscape in the pursuit of ever-growing inequality. The RSS disgraced and discredited at last as an evil force in Indian life. A new party was voted in, a composite party composed of all kinds of Indians, every religion and caste, urban poor, rural poor, the educated, all banded together by the disaster and determined to make something change. The ruling elite lost legitimacy and hegemony, and the inchoate, fractured resistance of victims coalesced in a party called Avasthana, Sanskrit for survival. The world's biggest democracy taking a new way. India's electrical power companies were nationalized where they weren't already, and a vast force was put to work shutting down coal-fired power plants and building wind and solar plants, and free river hydro, and non-battery electrical storage systems to supplement the growing power of battery storage. All kinds of things began to change. Efforts were renewed to dismantle the worst effects of the caste system. Those efforts had been made before, but now it was made a national priority. The new reality, and enough Indians were now ready to work for it. All over India, governments at all levels began to implement these changes. Lastly, though this was regretted by many, some more radical portion of this new Indian polity sent a message out to the world. Change with us, change now, or suffer the wrath of Kali. No more cheap Indian labor, no more sellout deals, no deals of any kind, unless changes were made. If changes weren't made by the countries that had signed the Paris Agreement, and every nation had signed it, then this portion of India was now their enemy and would break off diplomatic relations and do everything short of declaring military war. But economic war, yes, economic war. The world would see that this particular 1/6 of the population, formerly the working class for the world, could do. Time for the long post-colonial subalternity to end. Time for India to step onto the world stage as it had at the start of history and demand a better world, and then help to make it real. Whether this kind of aggressive stance would be revealed as a true national position or a posturing of a radical faction remained to be seen. It depended, some thought, on how far India's new national government was willing to go back up this Kali's group, was willing to go to back up this Kali group's threats to, in effect, unleash them. War in the age of the internet, the age of the global village, the age of drones, the age of synthetic biology and artificial pandemics. This was not the same as war in the past. Interesting. I don't know that I caught that the first time I read that. Artificial pandemics. If they were serious, it could get ugly. In fact, if even just the Kali faction of the Indian polity was serious, it could get very ugly. But two could play at those games. Indeed, everyone could play those games, not just the 195 nations that had signed the Paris Agreement, but all the various kinds of non-state actors, right down to individuals. And so came a time of troubles. Moving on to chapter 7. Try not to sip tea in the microphone. He was having panic attacks whenever he got hot, and then the panic attacks made him hotter still. Feedback loop, for sure. When he was stabilized enough to move him, we flew him to Glasgow. He had spent a year abroad there, he said, and we thought that familiarity might help. He didn't want to go home to the States, so we took him to Glasgow and kept him cool and took walks with him around the neighborhood at night. It was October, and so the usual rain and raw sea air. That seemed to comfort him. One night I was out there walking the streets with him, letting him take the lead. He hardly ever said a word, and I let him be. On this night, he was a little more talkative. He pointed out to me where he had gone to school, theaters he had frequented. Apparently, he had taken an interest in theater, done some work backstage with lighting and sets and costumes. Then when we found ourselves on Clyde Street, he wanted to walk out onto the pedestrian bridge that ran out over the river to the south bank. Out there in the dark, the city looked foursquare and massive. It's low for a city, not much different than it must have appeared a century or two ago, a little uncanny somehow, like a city in some dark fantasy. He stood there and looked down at the black water, elbows on the railing. He talked about various things. At one point, I asked him again if he would be going home. No, he said sharply. I'm never going back there. It was the blackest look I ever saw on him. Never, he said. I let it go. I didn't want to ask. We stood there leaning against the railing. It looked like the city was slowly floating in toward the hills. So why did I survive, he said all of a sudden. Why just me, out of all those people? I didn't know what to say. You just did, I said. Probably you were the healthiest person there, maybe one of the biggest. I don't know. You aren't that big, but maybe bigger than most Indians. He shrugged. Not really. Even a bit more body mass would help. You have to keep your core temperature under about 104. A few pounds could help with that. And a lifetime of better food and medical care. And you're a runner, right? I was a swimmer. That probably helped. A stronger heart, thinner blood, that sort of thing. Ultimately, I think it just means you were the strongest person there, and only the strongest survived. I don't think I was the strongest person there. Well, maybe you were better hydrated, or you stayed in the water more. They said they found you by the lake. Yes, he said. Something I said had troubled him. He said, I did stay submerged as much as I could, just my face up there to breathe all night long, but a lot of people were doing that. It added up to survival, I said. You made it. You were lucky. Don't say that. I don't mean lucky. It was chance. I mean, there's always an element of chance. He looked at the dark, low city, spangled with its night lights. It's just fate, he said. He put his forehead on the railing. I put a hand on his shoulder. Fate, I agreed. That was chapter 7. A lot of these chapters are very short, which I do appreciate. Chapter 8. Humans are burning about 40 gigatons. A gigaton is a billion tons of fossil carbon per year. Scientists have calculated that we can burn about 500 more gigatons of fossil carbon before we push the average global temperature over 2 degrees Celsius, higher than it was when the Industrial Revolution began. This is as high as we can push it, they calculate, before really dangerous effects will follow for most of Earth's bioregions, meaning also food production for people. Some used to question how dangerous the effects would be, but already more of the sun's energy stays in the Earth system than leaves it by about 0.7 of a watt per square meter of the Earth's surface. This means an inexorable rise in average temperatures, and a wet bulb temperature of 35 will kill humans. Even if unclothed and sitting in the shade, the combination of heat and humidity prevents sweating from dissipating heat, and death by hypothermia soon results. And wet bulb temperatures of 34 have been recorded since the year 1990, once in Chicago, so the danger seems evident enough. Thus, 500 gigatons. But meanwhile, the fossil fuel industry has already located at least 3,000 gigatons of fossil carbon in the ground. All these concentrations of carbon are listed as assets by the corporations that have located them, and they are regarded as national resources by the nation-states in which they have been found. Only about a quarter of this carbon is owned by private companies. The rest is in the possession of various nation-states. The notional value of the 2,500 gigatons of carbon that should be left in the ground, calculated by using the current price of oil, is on the order of 1,500 trillion US dollars. It seems quite possible that these 2,500 gigatons of carbon might even eventually come to be regarded as a kind of stranded asset. But in the meantime, some people will be trying to sell and burn the portion of it that they own or control while they still can. Just enough to make $1 trillion or $2, they'll be saying to themselves. Not the crucial portion, not the burn that pushes us over the edge, just one last little taking. People need it. The 19 largest organizations doing this will be, in order of size from biggest to smallest, Saudi Aramco, Chevron, Gazprom, ExxonMobil, National Iranian Oil Company, BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Pemex, Petróleos de Venezuela, PetroChina, Peabody Energy, ConocoPhillips, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, Iraq National Oil Company, Total SA, Sonatrach, BHP Billiton, and Petrobras. Executive decisions for these organizations' actions will be made by about 500 people. They will be good people, patriotic politicians, concerned for the fate of their beloved nation's citizens. Conscientious, hardworking corporate executives fulfilling their obligations to their board and their shareholders. Men, for the most part, family men, for the most part, well-educated, well-meaning. Pillars of the community, givers to charity. When they go to the concert hall of an evening, their hearts will stir at the somber majesty of Brahms' Fourth Symphony. They will want the best for their children. Moving on to chapter 9. This is going quickly. Down in Zurich's Naderdorf, the old medieval district bordering the east side of the Limmat, under the tower of the Grossmünster, Zwingli's austere warehouse of a cathedral, there were still some little bars tucked here and there, too stodgy to attract many tourists. Not that Zurich got many tourists in November. Rain was turning into sleet, and the old black cobbles in their pattern of overlapping fans were getting slippery. Mary Murphy glanced down a broader street that led to the river. There stood the construction crane that wasn't really a construction crane, but rather a work of art, a sculptor's joke at the ubiquity of cranes in Zurich. The city was always rebuilding itself. In one of the smallest bars, she sat down with Badim Bahadur, her chief of staff, who was hunched over a whiskey, reading his phone. He nodded at her in a morose greeting, pushed the ice around in his glass. "What's the word from Delhi?" she said, as she sat across from him. "It's to start tomorrow." She nodded at the waiter, pointed at Badim's drink. "Another whiskey." "What's the reaction?" "Bad," he shrugged. "Maybe Pakistan will bomb us, and we'll retaliate, and that will start a nuclear winter. That will cool the planet quite nicely." "I should think the Pakistanis would want this as much as anyone, or even more. A heat wave like the one that just happened could kill everyone there. They know that. They're just piling on. China is doing it too. We are now the pariah of the world, all for doing the needful. We're getting killed for getting killed. It's always that way." "Is it?" He glanced out the window. "I don't notice Europe hurting too badly." "This is Switzerland, not Europe. The Swiss stay out of shit like this. They always have. That's what you're seeing here." "Is it so different in the rest of Europe?" "They killed Greece for getting killed, remember? And the rest of southern Europe isn't doing much better. Ireland, neither, for that matter. We got killed by the Brits for centuries. Something like a quarter of all the Irish died in the famine, and about as many left the island. That was something." "Post-colonials," Badim said. "Yes. And of the same empire, too. It's funny how England never seemed to pay too much of a price for its crimes." "No one does. You pay for being the victim, not the criminal." Her whiskey arrived, and she downed half of it. "We're going to have to figure out how to change that. If there is a way." "Justice?" Badim made a skeptical face. "What is that? Come on, don't be cynical." "No, I mean it. Consider the Greek goddess of justice, bronze woman in a toga with a blindfold covering her eyes to make her be fair. Her scales held up to measure the balance of crime and punishment. No consideration given to individual influence. But nothing ever really balances in those scales. If it's an eye for an eye, maybe. That will balance out. But if someone is killed, no. The murderer gets fined or jailed for life. Is that a real balance? No. And thus, capital punishment. Which everyone agrees is barbaric. Because if killing is wrong, two wrongs don't make a right. And violence begets violence. So you try to find some equivalent, and nothing is equivalent. So the scales are never balanced, particularly if one nation murders another nation for 3 centuries, takes all its goods, and then says, "Oh, sorry, bad idea. We'll stop and all is well." But all is not well. Maybe India can get England to pay for this casting of dust. He shrugged. "It costs like €10. I don't see why everyone isn't supporting it 100%. The effect will only last 3 or 4 years at most, and during that time we can see what it does and decide whether we should keep doing it or not. Lots of people think it will have knock-on effects." "Like what?" You know them as well as I. If doing this stops the monsoon, you'll have doubled your own misery. So we decided to risk it, and that after that, it's no one else's business. But it'll be a worldwide effect. Everyone wants the temperatures lowered. Not Russia. I'm not so sure. The sea ice is melting and the permafrost is thawing. That's half their country. If their rivers don't freeze, Siberia has no roads for 9 months of the year. They're made of the cold there. They know that. There's cold and cold, Mary said. But it's colder than ever there sometimes. You know that. No, they're just piling on like everyone else. Someone takes the bull by the horns, grabs the wolf by the ears, and everyone takes the opportunity to stick knives in his back. I'm sick of it. She took another sip. Welcome to the world, she said. Well, I don't like it. He downed his drink. So what are we going to do? We're the Ministry for the Future. We have to take a stand on this. I know. We'll have to see what our scientists say about it first. He gave her a look. They will prevaricate. Well, they don't know enough now to make a considered judgment. So they'll say it's a good experiment, that we should run it and wait a decade and see what happens. As usual. But that's science, right? But we have to do more than the usual. We'll say that, and I'm sure we'll end up backing India. With money? 10 euros, sure, cash on the barrel. He laughed despite himself, but quickly his expression darkened. It isn't enough, he said. What we're doing with this ministry, I'm telling you, it isn't enough. Mary regarded him closely. This was a reproach, and he wasn't meeting her eye. Let's go for a walk, she suggested. I've been sitting all day. He didn't object. They polished off their drinks, paid, and walked out into the twilight, down to the crane statue, and then upstream by the Limmat in its stone channel. The black surface of the water sheeting past them, cracking the light reflected from the other side. Past the old stone cube of the Rathaus, as always. Mary marveled that the entire city government could have been stuffed into such a small building. Then past the Odeon and across the big bridge spanning the lake outlet to the tiny park on the other side where the statue of Ganymede stood, his uplifted hand seeming to hold up the moon low over the Zurichi. This was a place she often came to, something in the statue, the lake, the Alps far to the south, combined in a way she found stirring. She couldn't say why. Zurich life, she couldn't say. The world seemed a big place when she was there. Listen, she said to Badim, maybe you're right. Maybe there's no such thing as justice, in the sense of some kind of real reparation of a wrong. No eye for an eye, no matter what. Especially historical justice or climate justice. But over the long haul, in some rough sense, that's what we have to try for. That's what our ministry is about. We're trying to set things up so that in the future, over the long haul, something like justice will get created. Some long-term ledger of more good than bad. Bending the arc and all that. No matter what happened before, that's what we can do now. She pointed at Ganymede, holding his back hand aloft. The moon lay right there in it, as if he were about to throw it across the sky. Badim sighed. I know, he said. I'm here to try. And the look in his eye, distant, intense, calculating, cold, told Mary that he would. It made her shiver to see it. More relaxing for Mary, even entertaining, were her meetings with Tatiana Voznesenskaya, head of the ministry's legal division. They were in the habit of meeting on some mornings at the Uruguay Schwimmbad, and if it was warm enough, changing into their bathing suits and swimming out into the lake, freestyling in tandem, and then chatting as they did the breaststroke for a while, circling out there, looking at the city from the strange, low, offshore angle. Then back in to shower and sit in the Schwimmbad cafe over hot drinks. Tatiana was tall and dark, dramatic in that Russian way, of pale blue eyes and fashion model cheekbones, of grim high spirits and Fuligan black humor. She had gotten pretty high in the Russian State Department before running afoul of some part of the power structure there and deciding she would be better off in an international agency. Her expertise in Russia had been international treaty law, which she now brought to bear in working to find allies and legal means to advance the cause of defending the generations to come. This, she felt, was mostly a matter of establishing situations where those generations to come were given legal standing, such that their currently existing lawyers could file suits and be heard by courts. Not easy, given the reluctance of any court to grant standing to anyone or anything outside the magic circle of the law as written. But Tatiana had experience with most of the already existing international courts and was now working with the network of institutions for future generations and the Children's Trust and many other groups, all to leverage the power given to the ministry by its origins in the Paris Agreement. Mary often felt that it was really Tatiana who should have been made the head of the ministry, that Mary's experience in Ireland and the UN had been rather lightweight compared to Tatiana's tough career. Tatiana had waved this off when Mary once mentioned the thought over drinks. No, you're perfect. Nice Irish girl. Everyone loves you. I would wreck everything at once, bashing around like a KGB thug, which I am, she added with a dangerous glint in her eye. Not really, Mary said. No, not really, but I would wreck things. We need you at the top, getting us in the door. It's similar to legal standing, really. Less formal, but just as important. You have to get people to listen to you before you can make your case. That's what you do. People listen to you. Then we can go to work. I hope so. Do you really think we can get significant legal standing for people who don't exist yet? I'm not sure. On one hand, the circle of inclusion has been growing over historical time, which is kind of a precedent. More kinds of people given standing, even ecologies being given standing, as in Ecuador. It sets a pattern, and logically, it holds water. But even if we succeeded in that part, we have a second problem, maybe bigger, in the weakness of international courts generally. Do you think they're weak? Tatiana gave Mary a sharp look as if to say, please, be serious. Nations agree to them only if they like their judgments. But judgments always side with one side or the other, so the losing side is never pleased. And there is no sheriff for the world. So the U.S. does what it wants, and the rest of us also do what we want. The courts only work when some petty war criminal gets caught and everyone decides to look virtuous. Mary nodded unhappily. The Indians' flouting of the Paris Agreement with their geoengineering, not much different legally than the general disregard for the agreement's emission reduction targets, was just the latest example of this kind of behavior. So what do you think we can do to improve that situation? Tatiana shrugged. Rule of law is all we've got, she said darkly. We tell people that and then try to make them believe it. How do we do that? If the world blows up, they'll believe it. That's why we got the international order we got after World War II. Not good enough, Mary suggested. No, but nothing is ever good enough. We just make do. Tatiana brightened, although Mary saw the sly look that indicated a joke. We make a new religion, some kind of earth religion, everyone family, universal brotherhood. Universal sisterhood, Mary said, an earth mother religion. Exactly, Tatiana said, and laughed. As it should be, right? They toasted the idea. Write up the laws for that, Mary said. Have them ready for me when the time comes. Of course, Tatiana said. I have entire constitution already in here, and she tapped her forehead. All right, we've made it through chapter 9. How y'all feeling? I can see you all hanging in there. Just going to very quickly check in on the Rockfin folks. Oh man, Rich Diana. You are a scholar and a gentleman. Thank you so much for the very generous tip on Rockfin. Rich Diana said, "Carry on, young man. The world needs your voice in all its forms." Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. And check in on Twitter. I don't know who's watching on Twitter. Can never tell. Looks like quite a few people on Twitter. Well, then, great. Then, more people on Twitter than on YouTube. Interesting. Thank you, Bella. Thank you. I appreciate you. All right, so we're getting into the home stretch here. We've gone about 45 minutes. I'm going to do another maybe chapter or maybe two, and then we'll stop and maybe we'll have a little conversation about this. If anybody wants to chime in. Chapter 10. We took off from Bida and Darbhanga and the INS Garuda in Gandhinagar, mostly in Aleutian IL-78s. Bought long ago from the Soviet Union. We had some Boeing and Airbus refuelers too. They were old planes, and it was very cold inside them. Our suits were old too. They were hard to move in, and hardly anything as insulation. We got very cold up there, but the flights were relatively short. We flew to 60,000 feet, as high as the planes could get. Higher would have been better, but we couldn't do it. It took a couple of hours, as we always carried a maximum load. 2 planes got caught in the so-called coffin corner and stalled catastrophically, and one of the crews didn't get out. Once up there, we deployed the fuel lines and pumped the aerosols into the air. The plumes looked like dump fuel at first, but they were really aerosol particulates. We were told mostly sulfur dioxide and then some other chemicals, like from a volcano. But there wasn't ash like in a volcanic explosion. It was a mix made to stay up there and reflect sunlight. Manufactured at Bhopal and elsewhere in India. We flew most of our missions over the Arabian Sea, so the prevailing winds of late summer would carry the stuff over India before anywhere else. We wanted that. It was for us we were doing it, and some felt we might also avoid some criticism by doing it that way. But soon enough, what we released would get carried by the winds all over the atmosphere, mostly in the northern hemisphere, but eventually everywhere. There it would be deflecting some sunlight. Even in India, you could hardly see any difference in the sky. For all our lives, we were living under the ABC, the Asian brown cloud. So we were used to dusty skies. Our operation only made things a little whiter by day, and the sunsets were sometimes more red than before. Quite beautiful on certain days, but mostly things looked the same. The sunlight we deflected to space was said to be about a fifth of 1% of the total incoming. Very important, crucial stuff, but it's not really possible to see a difference that small. Global effect was said to be like Pinatubo's eruption in 1991, or some said a double Pinatubo. The total release was taken to the stratosphere in several thousand individual missions. We had a fleet of only 200 planes, so we each went up scores and scores of times, spread out over 7 months. That was a lot of work. Of course, it was a pretty small effort at these things as these things go, and if it helped to prevent another heat wave, it was worth doing. We knew the Chinese hated the idea, and Pakistan, of course, and although we flew only when the jet streams were running toward the east or northeast, there were times when those countries lay in the path of dispersion. And all over the world, people pointed out that the ozone layer would get hurt, which would be bad for everyone. Once a heat-seeking missile flew right by our plane. Vikram dodged it at the last minute. The plane squealed like a cat. No one ever found out who shot it at us, but we didn't care. We did what we were told. We were happy to do it. Everyone had lost someone they knew in the heat wave. Even if they hadn't, it was India, and it could happen again. anywhere in India and really anywhere in the world. As our officials told people over and over, even farther north, a heat wave could strike. Europe once suffered one that killed 70,000 people, even though Europe is so far north. Well more than half the land on Earth is at risk, so we did it. Day after day for 7 months and round the clock. What with maintenance and refueling and the filling of the tanks, it was a routine that took many thousands of people working together. We got tired, exhausted, but also we got into the rhythm of it. There were enough crews to fly once out every 3 missions per plane. For many weeks in the middle of it, it felt like it would go on forever. That it was all we were ever meant to do. We felt like we were saving India and maybe saving the world, but it was India we were concerned with. No more deadly heat waves, so we hoped. It was a very emotional time. Now, if I could go anywhere in the world and if someone speaks against what we did, I challenge them. You don't know anything, I tell them. It wasn't your people, so you don't care. But we know and we care. And there hasn't been a heat wave like this since. One may come again, no doubt of that, but we did what we could. We did the right thing. I must admit, I sometimes shout at people if they deny that. I damn them to hell, which is a place we in India have already seen. So I have no patience for people who object to what we did. They don't know what they're talking about. They haven't seen it, and we have. All right, chapter 11, extremely short. I'm going to read this, and then we'll break, and I'll kind of hopefully we'll have a little convo. Chapter 11, ideology, noun, an imaginary relationship to a real situation. In common usage, what the other person has, especially when systematically distorting the facts. But it seems to us that an ideology is a necessary feature of cognition, and if anyone were to lack one, which we doubt, they would be badly disabled. There is a real situation that can't be denied, but is too big for any individual to know in full, and so we must create our understanding by way of an act of the imagination. So we all have an ideology, and this is a good thing. So much information pours into the mind, ranging from sensory experience to discursive and mediated inputs of all kinds, that some kind of personal organizing system is necessary to make sense of things in ways that allow one to decide and to act. Worldview, philosophy, religion, these are all synonyms for ideology as defined above, and so is science, although it's the different one, the special one, by way of its perpetual cross-checking with reality tests of all kinds, and its continuous sharpening of focus. That surely makes science central to a most interesting project, which is to invent, improve, and put to use an ideology that explains in a coherent and useful way as much of the blooming, buzzing inrush of the world as possible. What one would hope for in an ideology is clarity and explanatory breadth and power. We leave the proof of this as an exercise for the reader. All right. So, has everybody read this book? Just checking in. It seems like most everybody has read it. And what do you all think about, I mean, the way the book starts, obviously with the heat wave, is exactly, what I've been talking about, or what I talk about on the Black Bear News channel so often is, one day something like that is going to happen. Unfortunately, it's not something that I'm looking forward to or wish on anybody. Right? But sometime in the future, there's going to just be an outsized heat wave. And maybe it won't even be a heat wave. Maybe it'll be, we've been seeing, more than heat waves, we've been seeing catastrophic flooding, right? I mean, we're already seeing, outsized effects of warming, as much as people want to deny the truth of that or blame it on geoengineering, or blame it on, interference from the elites on what's going on the planet. But I don't know. Maybe what year was it written? I don't know. It was released in 2020, I want to say. Let's see. I think it was released in 2020. I don't know why I can't find it. But I'm assuming so. I'm assuming it was written just prior. First paperback edition, October 2021. So originally published in hardcover in October 2020. So there you go. What do y'all... Does anybody have any ideas or about the possibility of a heat wave that would take people out like that? Do you think that's possible this year, next year, 5 years? Definitely in the next 10 years? What, does anybody have any thoughts on that? Bella says at the time of the novel's publication, American science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson was 68 years old and living in Davis, California. He had previously written 20 novels and received the Robert A. Heinlein Award and the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Imagination and Service to Society for his body of work. Cool. Well, yeah, guys. I still can't get anybody to chat with me on Twitter. My God, y'all. Just say hello. Hello. Bella says, yes, I think this year will be very hard on the people of the Middle East and India. Well, I guess, okay, so we saw, we see little bits and pieces of it here and there, right? Like Brazil had a massive heat wave last summer. Famously, Taylor Swift still performing a concert right in the middle of like one of the worst heat waves there, and I think several people died. I don't know. I'm seeing more catastrophe in the flood area. Not to say that we're not going to see a heat wave like that, but we're going to eventually, and I sound like a broken record, but eventually we're going to see a heat wave that is going to do something like this, right? Take out 100,000 people or more. And then people will go, oh dang. Well, it happens every year. It's a heat wave, like, right? The deniers will be out in force on Twitter. This happened 250 years ago. There was a heat wave, killed thousands of people. It happens all the time. It's just summer. I don't know. I imagine it would have to happen it would be interesting if it happened in a U.S. city. Bella says this time last year it was still snowing in the Finger Lakes. Yeah, no, the weather is wacky, man. The weather is all mixed up. We just got a snowstorm a week ago. We had a atmospheric river in Northern California. Like literally a week ago, we had a huge storm come through Northern California, and it snowed. It did snow, but it's finally looking like it might want to be summer here. Finally, in Los Angeles, the mercury is slowly edging up, and the sun is staying out, and the days are getting longer. So, hopefully it doesn't bring too much heat, but we're going to, we'll talk about it on Monday, I'm sure. Mexico is suffering. Let's see if I can find it. I think Mexico just set a record for May. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it. I'm not sure. My fingers hurt. I don't know why. I was playing guitar earlier. Maybe that's why. I think I was going a little too hard. From Scott Duncan, Mexico just observed its hottest day in May, 124, almost 125 degrees. This is less than 1C from the all-time national record for any month. Sadly, this heat wave is far from over. This is May 9th, so 2 days ago they hit 100 and basically 25 in Mexico. So eventually we're going to see something like that. I mean, we've already seen. And I mean, it was 2 decades ago, right? Was it 2003 when like 30,000, they say 70,000. I don't know what the real number is because it's between 30,000 and 70,000. People died in Europe during a heat wave, which is freaking phenomenal. I mean, that's a huge number, but that was like 20 years ago because nobody in Europe has air conditioning. And they're not used to stuff like that. So was it 2003? I want to say it was. Anyways. I feel like more likely than not, it's going to be something that happens in the next few years. Again, hopefully not. Or maybe they're maybe they're already breaking out the geoengineering for us to keep that from happening for as long as possible. Who knows? All right, guys. Let me make sure I didn't miss anybody. Thanks for tuning in for this special edition of Black Bear News and the reading of the Ministry for the Future. And let's see. Bella says the record number of heat-related deaths in Phoenix's Maricopa County for 2023 trounced the previous record by more than 50%. This is the 7th consecutive record-setting year. So, well, I didn't know that, and you don't really hear people talking about that, do you? Interesting. You would think if people were worried about the planet getting hotter and people succumbing to a hotter planet, you would think that they might, this would be a little more public knowledge, right? All right, guys. Thank you for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. Thanks again, Rich Diana, for the very generous tip on Rockfin. And we'll see you guys all on Monday at the regular time of 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight. And until next time, peace.